Greetings, listeners. Welcome to Consulting Between Friends. I am your host, Michael Holmes Jr. Have you ever wondered what it takes to start a podcast? As well, how to start your own podcast? You will receive secret techniques that I used to create my podcast. I will discuss what I have learned from the beginning as a podcast host, and as well what accomplishment the podcast has achieved. I will give you guidance to encourage you to start a podcast and how to stay focused on your podcast journey. The podcast Consulting Between Friends will have a 1 year anniversary on May 4th, 2022. This is the anniversary episode for the podcast. The topic is podcast, insight for future podcasters. We will return after a message from our sponsor. Everyone is always planning things, and advertising is needed to make it happen. So, if it's personal or business, let Pinpoint Designs and Images solve that problem. With Pinpoint Designs and Images LLC, you will receive quality work and professional service at a great price. The service that is offered: flyers, business cards, programs, invitations, photo books, ad booklets, and much more. Michael Holmes Jr., owner/principal designer of Pinpoint Designs and Images LLC. Contact me by email or social media. Email address is pinpointdesignsandImages@gmail.com, and Instagram Pinpoint Designs, and Facebook Pinpoint Designs and Images. We are back. The Consulting Between Friends podcast has been a journey for the first year. The beginning of the podcast was just a thought at first. I started listening to different podcasts I enjoyed before the pandemic. This is how I came up with the idea to start my own. Also, I wanted to combine all my talents into one place. My first steps for the podcast was: 1. My current resources I have. 2. My personality. 3. My communication skills. 4. My research skills. 5. My organizing skills. 6. My graphic design skills. My current resources are the people I am connected with in different organizations I belong to in the past and present. For example, the Jeremiah Group and public officials I know as well. With the Jeremiah Group, I developed skills that has taught me how to become a leader for others. Learning how to be a leader allowed me to know how to run the podcast as professionally as possible. Knowing different public officials in the community allowed me to learn how to conduct my behavior in all places, which means not being afraid of meeting different people who are higher up in a profession than yourself. My friends with different talents, such as a professional DJ, for the podcast, you need to have original music created by someone. The reason is if you don't have original music created, you can have your podcast rejected from all major platforms. This will happen if you don't have the permission to use the song by the artist. With one of my good friends, a DJ allowed me to have a song that can represent the podcast. Also, many other people I meet over the years who will support me for the podcast. My personality was inviting to others. When I was listening to different podcasts, what I realized is how their personality attracted different people. You have to know how to relate to different people you meet and still have their attention as well. Your voice has to sound a certain way and how you pronounce your words. If you speak too fast, people will not be able to understand you. This was something I had to practice on since sometimes I speak too fast and jumble all my words together. I had to listen carefully after recording myself to see first if I could understand myself. If I can't understand my own self, how will someone else understand and listen to my content as well? Everyone has their own personality, and sometimes it requires time to find your own voice. For example, when you listen to the radio, TV, or a podcast, you realize right away how the person sounds to keep you listening. I found out my voice is very unique and has a tone to have someone listen to me. My tone of voice is listening to NPR, known as National Public Radio, as a news reporter. Also, I realized my voice has unique sound for narration for storytelling. This is what I learned about myself as a podcaster. Everyone has a unique voice, and you just have to learn how to grab the person's attention. My communication skills was something I knew I had very strong. You have to have very good communication skills to have a podcast. You have to know how to communicate to all different kinds of people. Everyone has different personalities, and you have to know how to relate to the person you are interviewing. I develop high communication skills by being in the public. From working with my Jeremiah group in different political campaigns in the community, by knocking on doors and phone calls. What I learned right away is how to grab the person's attention when speaking to them. When you are walking up to someone's house to ask them questions, you have to be respectful to the person and explain very clearly what you are telling them. If you don't listen or pay attention to the person's body language, you just lost your opportunity to reach the person. When you are on the phone with someone you don't know, it is really hard to grab the person's attention before hanging up in your face. Here is an example on how to have a conversation on the phone. Hi, this is Michael with the Jeremiah Group. I am calling today to see are you planning on voting in the upcoming election. When you receive a yes or a no from the person, the next process is ending the phone call with a thank you. For instance, thank you for taking your time to answer my question and have a nice day. What I learned from both of these examples is how it's important to get to the point with your conversation. If you don't have a good introduction to explain yourself, the listener would not pay attention right away. If not, the listener would not pay attention or care about what you have to offer. When creating some content for the podcast, it requires some sort of research. The first thing to remember, you will not have all the right answers, but there is someone who does, which requires some research on the topic. Yes, research. If you want to give valuable information to others, it requires some homework. I was always very curious about different things, which always causes me to find the answer to something. Some topics I choose requires research and lots of time to put it together. I am also learning about the topic as I do my research. Research requires a lot of patience and time, which I enjoy doing. For example, research skills consist of reading, writing, and lots of time devoted to the topic of choice. When you do your research on a topic, you are giving the listener knowledge they are looking for and trust from you. That's right, trust. If you continue giving the listeners valuable information, they will continue supporting you, which is very important to all podcasters. Organizing skills are very important. You have to know how to organize your material for each podcast episode. I learned if you have structure in your podcast, this will keep the listener's attention. Organizing skills and structure abilities is what I have very strong in. Organizing is very important to a podcast. You have to know how to organize your content you are presenting to your listeners. This way, the listener can pay attention to your information you are offering. The steps of structure are very important to running a podcast. Step 1, your introduction for the beginning of your episode. Step 2, your content you are presenting to the listeners. Step 3, your call to action for the listeners. Step 4, your closing of the topic you discuss in the episode. Step 5, your way to tell the listeners to follow you. With these steps as followed, you will create a successful podcast. My graphic design skills was a way to display my talent to others. The artwork cover is very important to the podcast. This is the first thing people will see about your podcast. It has to explain what the podcast is about and grabs the person's attention right away. For example, the color of the artwork, the text of the artwork, and the size of the image. The color has to be very attractive to grab the person's attention. The text needs to be easy to read on the artwork. The image has to be a certain size for the approval. When I was doing my research for the artwork cover, I knew this was my opportunity to showcase my graphic design skills. As a graphic designer, I pay attention to details very carefully, which means how the font is typed and easy to read, as well how the artwork cover is presented to others. Podcast knowledge I learned. Creating an outline for your podcast will make the workflow run smoothly. This was the first thing I did before recording an episode. Lay out all your details for each podcast episode. Create structure for the podcast. Create pros and cons lists to have an overview of the podcast. For example, what makes your podcast stand out and what you need to improve for your podcast. If you are producing your own podcast, it takes lots of patience and time. Producing my own podcast is what I learned first. From creating the time to come up with an episode and writing down what I wanted to discuss for the episode. If you are planning on editing your podcast episode, remember it takes listening skills and lots of patience to create an episode. Editing process for me takes 2 hours or more to create a professional podcast episode. The app I use to create the podcast is Adobe Audition, which is a recording app that professionals use. I wanted to learn how to produce my own podcast with Adobe Audition. I found information online how to use the app. The art to create one episode is an exciting experience that I love to do. The purpose of creating a podcast. When you decide to create a podcast, you have to focus on what is the purpose of creating the podcast. Deciding on what you want to focus on to gravitate the listener to the podcast. For example, my focus was being informative, educational, and motivating for all different kinds of people. Once you determine your focus for the podcast, the sky is the limit. One way I accomplished so much with the podcast is having a mentor that can guide me in the right direction. My mentor is also my podcast distributor. With his experience as a podcaster and a producer, this allows me to stay on top of things. By having a podcast distributor, the company can focus on the logistics that is needed to handle the podcast. For instance, uploading the podcast episodes, keeping track of the podcast downloads, and how to monetize your podcast. That's right. Monetize means making money for your podcast. Monetize should be a goal to focus on in the future. Resources to learn about podcasting. 1. Buzzsprout YouTube videos. Buzzsprout is great to learn everything about podcasting. I have learned a lot from Buzzsprout on how to start the podcast from equipment that is needed. As well, helpful information that all podcasters has to know. 2. Mike Russell's YouTube videos. This is how I learned the basics of Adobe Audition. Mike explains the process very clearly and gives good examples along the way for recording. Also, Mike offers lots of helpful tutorial videos for all podcasters from creating audio and producing. After a short break, we will return. We are back. First, let's hear from my podcast distributor on my accomplishments as a podcaster. Ahmad Rashad with My Producer Podcasts.
Hey, Michael, congratulations on your podcast anniversary. We actually call it a pod anniversary. It's been a pleasure and a joy to be working with you for this. Wow, this year went by super fast, but just simply experiencing and witnessing your growth. You're very coachable. You're a quick learner. You're a self-starter. You like to educate yourself. You like to go above and beyond the call of duty, and the way that you plan and prepare and interact on your show is exactly how a professional should. You are doing a fantastic job. Your listeners are proof of that. Your podcast numbers are consistently growing, and just really looking forward to seeing what you are able to do in the next year, 2, 3 years. So thank you for allowing me to be along for the ride through your podcast journey. I pray and hope that much, much more comes for you. God bless you, and look forward to speaking with you again and working on your next episode.
Now I will list the most popular episodes that were enjoyed by listeners. 1. Consulting Between Friends trailer. 2. Mardi Gras, an experience to remember. 3. How stress affects you and how to overcome it. 4. COVID-19 vaccinations, problems and solutions. 5. How redistricting affects the population in a state, Part 1. 6. How redistricting affects the population in a state, Part 2. 7. Racism among African Americans by law enforcement. 8. The memories that we all treasure during the holidays. 9. Hurricane Ida, the lives that changed. 10. COVID in You, traditional and non traditional approaches to educate and motivate the unvaccinated. The podcast Consulting Between Friends has listeners in over 10 countries. For instance, United States of America, Spain, India, Israel, and Europe. Another achievement the podcast has received is 1,000 downloads last year in October. The podcast downloads from the beginning to present is 2,559 and counting. The podcast continues to grow new listeners every day. Thank you to all my guests who was a part of the first year of Consulting Between Friends podcast. Thank you from my family and friends for supporting me with the podcast. Without the support of all my listeners, this podcast will not have been successful. Next, you will hear listeners who enjoyed the podcast. From my dad, Michael Holmes Sr. Good day, listeners. I just wanted to give my input about the podcast. It was enjoyable and informative. I've listened to over 20 plus interviews ranging from different subjects, such as basic conversations around the table, to political question and answers from politicians, lifestyles, activities of locals. P.S. Not to mention me knowing some of the personalities of the interviewees, friends, nephews, and local politicians. Keep on with informing the public, consulting between friends. My guest today is Shalonda, and I welcome her to Consulting Between Friends.
Thank you.
Thank you. I'm glad you're able to be a part of this anniversary episode.
Well, I appreciate it. I appreciate you inviting me.
You're welcome. Now we're about to start. What are your overall views of the podcast Consulting Between Friends?
Well, I'm going to be quite forward with you, Mr. Holmes. Is a podcast that I find to be very informative. I appreciate your candor and your tenacity, and I appreciate every topic because I'm always learning something new. And I think it is something good for us to have to learn information and things that are going on in our communities overall.
Well, I like how you just explained that, and I appreciate you being a consistent listener to the podcast.
Yes, sir.
What episodes of Consulting Between Friends podcast did you enjoy and why?
Well, my favorite of all of them would have to be the Mardi Gras episode that was back in February. I actually, once again, I learned a lot in that episode about Mardi Gras. I'm originally from New Orleans, but there's a lot about Mardi Gras that I did not know. And thanks to you, Mr. Holmes, I learned a lot about the background of Mardi Gras, about everything that is a part of Mardi Gras, all the throws and how they get everything together. I learned a lot from it. Another one, which was near and dear to my heart, was the episode that you did on stress. And you had Mr. Victor Sims as a part of that episode.
Yes.
I enjoyed that one. That was an episode from back in November. I enjoyed that episode because I myself have had issues with stress and trying to figure out how to overcome it. And in our community, especially now in this day and age, and back in the past, it was also a stigma, for us to actually seek therapy in the Black community. It was like a taboo. But the fact that you came up with that podcast, it gave a lot of insight on, things that you can do. And the fact that you had a therapist there that gives information to let people know that it's okay if you have an issue, to seek therapy for it. And that was very informative as well. I have listened to all of the podcasts. I have listened to every one of them. And over time, I've been following you since I found out about them. And the one on Mardi Gras and the one on stress was really good. I also enjoyed the 2021 year in review that you did in December. But overall, it would have to be the Mardi Gras episode that I enjoyed the most because it was very informative. I also checked out your 400, I'm going to say 400 festivals because that's what it should have been called. I had no idea Louisiana has that many festivals in our state. I never knew that.
Hmm.
But I enjoyed all of them. I enjoyed every last one of them.
Well, I appreciate you saying all of that. And to let you know, since you say you enjoyed the Mardi Gras one, that is one of my top episodes that people really enjoyed everywhere. I had a
Oh,
total of 300 downloads of that episode in 2 weeks. That's what my distributor
wow.
told me. And when I heard
Wow.
that, I'm like, wow.
I'm not
So,
surprised. I'm definitely not surprised. I'm not surprised. It also featured my best friend as well. And it was very informative. I mean, y'all did a good job on that. I appreciate that. And this podcast has been a huge inspiration to me because I aspire to do my own in the future. But I love the way you have the layout. You're very informative. All your information, you can tell you take your time and do your research and get everything lined up for the people.
that is true. I do a whole lot of research and I make sure that it's very informative for people to understand different topics.
Right. I mean, it's actually noticeable. I mean, your tenacity, and like I said, you're remarkably candid at every topic. I mean, you on point with everything, and I'm like, wow, I can't believe someone actually, take their time and sit down and get all this information together and bring it to the people because that's what we need. That's what we need, and I appreciate it, Mr. Holmes. I truly appreciate that.
You're welcome. I appreciate you, Shalonda, for being a continued listener to Consulting Between Friends podcast. There's more to come. And as you know right now, I'm in season 2.
Okay, I look forward to more episodes, and once again, thank you, Mr. Holmes, for your time and for your invitation. And I look forward to episodes to come.
Thank you. In closing, I hope the information provided about podcasting was very helpful to everyone who has an interest in becoming a podcaster. The advice I mentioned is my knowledge of being a podcast host. The podcast has been a blessing for me to share my thoughts to the world. If you want to share your thoughts as well, become a podcaster. You will realize the possibilities that it will offer to you and others. Remember, stay focused and you can achieve anything you desire. One last thing, remember to support Black business owners and always reach beyond any of your goals in life. What's going on in the news? Everyone enjoys traveling to different places, but the last 2 years have made it impossible and unsafe. Before, if you wanted to travel on the airplane or a train, it was required to wear a mask for your safety. Now, the mask mandate for travel is no longer in place. Now, if you want to wear a mask for travel, it is considered optional. The way I feel about this, if you feel you need to wear a mask for traveling, then do so. Everyone has different health issues, and only you know about your own health. You can click the links about traveling without a mask in the podcast notes under What's Going On in the News. The social media app Twitter has an offer from Elon Musk. Elon Musk is the CEO of Tesla Electronic Vehicles and CEO of SpaceX. Elon wants to change how Twitter interface looks and how it operates. With Elon offering to buy Twitter, has some people wondering why Twitter should be his next investment. I think Elon has an abundance of ideas that can improve how Twitter operates. For instance, his way of thinking has changed the way people function every day. Without people like Elon Musk, we will not have new inventions and ideas. You can click the links about Elon Musk in the podcast notes under What's Going On in the News. Thank you for listening to Consulting Between Friends. This podcast is available on Spotify, Google Podcasts, iHeartRadio, and Apple Podcasts, as well other platforms that are available. So like and subscribe. Need to contact us and leave us a comment? You can find us on Instagram at Consulting the letter B Friends. Once again, Consulting B Friends. An email address is consulting the letter B friends at gmail.com. Once again, consulting B friends at gmail.com. Consulting Between Friends now has a way for listeners to share their feedback about the podcast. The listeners can now share their feedback on Discord. The link will be available in the podcast notes and on the podcast website. Consulting Between Friends. Thanks to everyone for making this possible. The host, Michael Hoves Jr. and co-host Shay R. Jones. The producer and content creator, Michael Hoves Jr. The artwork cover, Michael Hoves Jr. Original music, a DJ name / references, Buzzsprout YouTube channel, Mike Russell YouTube channel. Special guest, Shalonda Smith Lazard. Content distributor, My Producer Podcasts.